So let's move on to part 2.
For part 2, we are going to cover systems thinking principles and dimension. So let's start with systems thinking principles.
We learned that we live in an environment which is actually a system. So basically, we live and function within the system. Though we might not realize it, we are actually influenced by the system in terms of our daily activities, our daily things that we do. And not only that, the systems, on the other hand, are also being influenced by us. So based on this, there are 4 items in systems thinking principles. The first one is the big picture. The second one is long term, short term. The third one is dynamic, complex, and interdependent. And the fourth principle is measurable versus non-measurable data. So the first principle is the big picture. So what does big picture mean? So the big picture basically represents the holistic thinking or the holistic view. So in order for you to find or you come up with the solution for a certain problem, you need to widen your focus to include the bigger system. So by this, more effective solution can be discovered. So let's look at the example for the big picture. Right, so let's say we have this one company who are selling the water filter. So we have this group of customer who are very disappointed in the service of the company. So they said that there are service delay. Right, so when we say that service delay, so of course we are focusing on the customer service department. So what will be the solution? So we will force the service technician and of course the service order taking system. Okay, they need to do their work faster than their usual speed, right? So that they can serve these people. However, when we look into the big picture, the problem didn't come from the customer service department, but comes from the sales group. So these people are trying to boost their sale by saying that there are free installation service. So there will be a lot of customer who bought their product. Okay, however, this information didn't get to be communicated to this customer service department. So when they don't have this information, so they don't have the opportunity in order for them to add more stuff into their department. So when they have no time to add more stuff into their department, so that's why there are service delay here. So what can we do when we have a problem or situation? So you cannot simply jump into a solution or conclusion, but you need to look through the bigger picture to identify the root cause of the problem. So the second principle is long-term, short-term. So the idea of system thinking is that you need to find the balance between short-term and long-term, which we call as the term perspective. So behavior which leads to short-term success can actually hurt the long-term success. Okay, for example, okay, so what does salesmen do? So they try to sell as much as possible, okay, in order for them to get the commission and also profit. So let's say we have this one salesman who are trying to sell the skin whitening product. Okay, so he claims that the product can make the skin whiter within 4 days of usage. So the potential customer listen to it and they become attracted to the product. So they bought them. And these people will also recommend the product to their friends. Okay, because let's say it is very cheap, but it is said that the product is so efficient. So we can see in a short period of time, a lot of items were sold. They managed to boost the sales and gain a lot of profit. Okay. However, because the salesman lies about the product in order to boost the sale, so we can look at the pattern in a long-term period, right? So people would not trust the salesman again, which in turn will drop the sales. Okay, so that's what will happen if the salesmen are trying to achieve success for a short period of time. It will hurt the long-term situation. The third principle is dynamic, complex, and interdependent. So a glimpse at any organizational structure will reveal system within many other systems. So they are very dynamic, so very complex, and very independent in nature. So in order to make sense of such complexity, humans tend to oversimplify and make decisions based on those oversimplification. Right, so that's the nature of human. That's what human do. So systems thinking remind us that once we simplify things, it is actually important for us to zoom back out and take into account the whole picture before making any decision. So we need to be aware of the system's relationship. The fourth principle is measurable versus non-measurable data. So there are plenty of tangible data metrics in the workplace and also in the environment. But what do we do with all the intangible information? So because we have both, right? So we account for it also, which is the intangible information, and allow it to influence our understanding alongside the tangible factors or tangible data that we have, because both are important. So what are the example of measurable versus unmeasurable data? So the measurable data, for example, we have sales figure, okay, we have the cost. What about the non-measurable data? We have the staff moral, and we also have the customer attitude and a lot more other non-measurable data that are available. Right, so let's say a company is trying to boost the sales figure and they plan to do a certain action or activity. They need to identify also in terms of their staff. What can the action that they do to boost the sales figure will have on their staff moral, right? So they need to look into both data that they have.
Now let's move on to the four systems thinking dimension.
So what is dynamical dimension? It is thinking in dynamical processes, or we call it as beyond snapshot thinking. So what is beyond snapshot thinking? We try to recognize patterns over time, okay, in terms of the oscillations, in terms of the feedback loops, in terms of the delay, and we also foreseeing future development. What will happen in the future, in 5 years time, in 10 years time?
So systems have a certain behavior over time. The typical features of a system would be the time delays and also oscillations. So one example is try to adjust the aircon temperature. So it will take a certain amount of time to reach the desired temperature that you want. Right, so this is because of the time dimension that exists, which is the time delay.
So apart from recognizing the pattern in dynamical dimension, so dynamic thinking also means to foresee the future development. So it is not sufficient if you just look into the past development, because you need to bring the system forward. So in the practical steering of the system, you need to foresee or forecast any possible things that you can do in the future. So how we do that? Normally we use the simulation models. So it is very helpful. So in order for people to foresee the future developments that they can implement in their system. So the second dimension is model-based dimension. So what is model-based dimension? It is basically thinking in models or awareness of system. So we have the model or the assumption of the reality, okay, that we can use. So we can only think according to our picture and views of the world, which are necessarily models of the world itself. So we have two types of models that we can use. The first one is the qualitative models, include the verbal description, the causal loop, and the second one we have quantitative models, for example stock and flow, and also equations and a lot more. Right, so thinking in models require us to construct, we need to validate, we need to develop models which represent the reality for us to understand the current problems or the current situation. One example of the verbal description that we have is, for example, a EITM student wants to improve himself or herself all around, may spend his or her time, energy and money so on study, social work and entertainment. He or she would then obtain experience, knowledge and satisfaction. Based on this verbal description, we can do a model from it. So the model that can describe the student, the first one we have the controls, okay, which we call as A. Okay, so what would be the controls? The controls are time, energy and money, right? And then we have object. So what will be the object in this statement? Study, social work and entertainment, right? And then we have the performance. So what will be the performance? Experience, knowledge and satisfaction. Okay, so if you put more time in study, okay, so you will gain more experience. But then what will happen to your energy, social work and knowledge, money, entertainment and satisfaction? So this is one of the example of the verbal example that we have. So the third dimension is feedback or feed-forward dimension. So in this dimension, we need to think in loops and also network. So thinking in loops and network, we introduce the interrelated structures. We'll have the direct effects, we'll have the feedback loops and also network of interrelations. So we also have the one-way cause effect. So one-way cause effect is called as functional or linear thinking. So functional or linear thinking is very different with interrelated thinking. So interrelated thinking is thinking in interrelated, so and also the systematic structure. So interrelated thinking would produce the direct effect and also the indirect effect. So these two would eventually leads to the feedback loops. So the first part of feedback or feed-forward dimension is the feedback. So feedback is seen as an influence from output back to input. So we have two basic feedbacks. The first one is reinforcing feedback, which changes in the whole system is feedback to amplify the original change. For example, like praising a student for good result. So what happens if we praise the student? So of course it will increase the motivation, and in turn the student will put more effort into the study and get a better result, right? So that is the reinforcing feedback. Okay, the second one we have is balancing feedback. Changes in the whole system is feedback to oppose the original change and so dampen the effect. For example, like criticizing a child for bad behavior. Okay, so what will happen if we criticize a child for their bad behavior? So they will try to behave themselves and show a good attitude, right? So that they will not be criticized with their bad behavior. So the second one is feed forward. So feed forward comes from our ability to anticipate or to predict the future. So reinforcing feed forward arises from prediction or anticipation, which drives the system away from the predicted state. For example, when you expect to fall, you often do so because your mind have said that you are going to fall. So that's what will happen. Another example is when you expect to succeed, your energy and optimism will help you and make you likely to succeed. If you try to focus on a certain thing and you think that you may have a opportunity or success in a certain area, so it should drive your energy and also optimism. So that is what we have in feed forward dimension. And the fourth dimension is the pragmatical dimension or the practice. So what we have in pragmatical dimension? So we try to see that we can do or we can practice the certain thing or this the certain solution in a certain area. So we look into the steering of the system to find the leverage point, or we look into the counterintuitive behavior. We look also into the proper intensity and the timing of action in the pragmatical dimension, whether this can be practiced or not in the real situation. So we look into the right action at the right time in the right place. That's what people want to find, and the ability for practical system management and also the system control, right? So this is basically on how we practice it in our real life. Systems thinking has always also a pragmatic component, so we focus on the practice. It deals not just with contemplating about the system, it is also interested in system-oriented action. So one of the fundamental questions of practical systems management is which of the system's components are subject to direct change. So in social system, it is often impossible to change the behaviors of others directly. Okay, one can only change one's own behavior. If you have been using a certain method for a certain period of time, it might be hard for the people to change the way they work. Okay, in an economic system, the producer usually has no direct control over the market because the marketing activities are usually the actions of the supplier side in order to induce the desired reaction on the demand side. So in pragmatical dimension, in systems thinking, we try to find what or which parts of the components that are um, direct to subject to the direct change or can be changed in terms of the practice.